Welcome. So today we're going to learn about segregation in Fresno and how it actually has a lot to do with the Chinese who came and actually started the segregation. And unfortunately, the people who mistreated them actually redlined them, and it kind of started this segregation of Chinese that we still see today. So let's actually get in here. Let me share my screen. And all righty, here we go. Okay. If we're in class, I would ask you guys, where do you live? What looks around you? What is around you? Is it a nice area? Are good schools? Are there still effects? And some students who say there are bad schools, I always ask, where do you live? And actually, you can find that it's actually from a certain part of Fresno. Now, we're going to go over today the beginning of racial segregation, which totally affects Fresno today. The Chinese in West Fresno and Chinatown's role as a red light district, 1870s and 1920s, by Ramon, Chacon. It's published in the Southern California Quarterly in 1988 and wonderful for art class. Our learning objectives today are going to go over the beginning of racial segregation, the Chinese in West Fresno, and Chinatown's role in the red light district, and the beginning of segregation and the effects today. All right. So a lot of people don't know where Fresno is, right? And sometimes Fresno is, jokingly in a kind of a negative light sometimes in California. It's not LA, it's not Silicon Valley, it's not San Francisco. And so people who are not from the area, sometimes have a somewhat negative view of Fresno. But actually, it's nicer than what people say. So in Fresno, I want to go over the history, was founded in 1870s. And I say founded in quotes because obviously it was Native American land. This is Native American land. It was taken away from them forcibly and very unjustly. And actually, the Native Americans are still in Fresno. So we got to keep that in mind. And we have Native Americans and Native American lots of different Native American groups that are still living in Fresno. So please keep that in mind. All right. So Fresno has segregated enclaves where large numbers of ethnic minority groups reside, right? And that's always been, and even today, it's a very diverse place. Now, Fresno's west side represents the most segregated and quote unquote ghettoized, and that's what the author talks about. And actually today, if you look, and I can, if we're in class, we'd have this great conversation like, where do you live, and what's the air pollution in your area? How are your schools rated in comparison to Clovis? And again, I wish we could have that. So if you want to write that in your discussion, I would love to read that. So his study aims, this historian, he looked at Fresno, and he looked at the development of the west side as a segregated enclave. So, and because it was a segregated place that started in Fresno, but also accompanied a red light district. A red light district is generally a place where high crime, prostitution, and during the 1870s and 1920s, the Chinese community were not allowed to live any other place, and so they were pushed into this red light district. Yes, and so there's gambling, there's drugs, there's prostitution, and there's like a long history of that. And actually, there is still an ancient Chinatown in Fresno that you can actually visit. It's like almost gone, but people, lots of history there. So 1850s, the rural area contracted Coarsegold, and these areas. Let me see this. Can't see this thing here. And Coarsegold, Fort Miller, and Millerton. Yes, so fascinating. So first, hundreds of Chinese miners who settled in Fresno County came to work in the gold mines. Of course, they also did the railroad, of course. In 1882, the railroad was completed, and they had to farm, so they became grape pickers. So a lot of times people think of Latinos as grape pickers, in terms of this area. But actually, historically, a lot of them have been Asian, particularly Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Armenian, Portuguese. So there's a lot of history of just agriculture stuff. Okay, and so again, they were out of work, these Chinese, and so they went and they became grape pickers. So they really affected, how we farm. So there was early redlining in Fresno. Redlining is something where they usually put a red line across a city, and if you live in that area, it's considered a bad area, and you cannot live in the good part area. Okay. So, and then that all the concentrated crime is always in that red line area. So 1873, after two Chinese purchased two lots on the East Road, basically the white community was like, no, you cannot live here. And so they started redlining. They got together and they said, hey, let's not sell any land to any of these Chinese, right? And again, they didn't want to live near them. And so they forced them to live in this area of West Fresno. And again, you still see the effects today. You still see how, people are mistreated. And even today, the areas of West Fresno are not as nice as other parts of Fresno, right? I'll always have students tell me where they live and how, their schools were not the best. Okay. And again, that has 100% directly effect from the Chinese back in the day, how they were mistreated, right? So people came together, did not want to sell them land and forced them to live in a certain place. So they had a crime in the area. And even today, there's actually oral histories I've heard of in the Henry Madden Library of realtors who are told not to sell to minorities, and particularly in Clovis, right? So that's in the 1980s. That's very recent, okay? All right, West Fresno side is the red light district, okay? So the early 1900s, is in the simplest terms, the red light district became a quote, ethnic ghetto. So all the minorities lived in this, well, actually forced to live in this area, right? And again, there's prostitution, gambling, opium, liquor, right? Fresno just had a terrible reputation, right? It was known for this, the whole city. And so it was in this area in particular, a red light district within the city. And so this might be one of the origins of, why Fresno has not the sterling reputation in, I would say in California or other places as well. Now, other groups settled in West Fresno. We had 1920s, you had African Americans, you had Japanese, you had Italians, you had Russians. The Chinese population in 1900s was around 1104, and 1920 it was around 617. Now, it's your question, why is the population went down over time? Well, if you watch my other videos, you'll know that it was actually all men. And so they died out. They never got to marry. And again, this has so much to do, if you're interested in Asian American male studies and how Asian Americans are always viewed in males in a negative light, right? They're asexualized, they're feminized, right? And it had a lot to do with how they treated the original Chinese, right? Didn't allow them to have families, didn't allow them to get married, didn't allow them to bring their wives, right? They were red lines the areas, and they were assumed to be, negative, which is the yellow peril myth, right? And which warped into the model minority myth, okay? So really terrible. So Italians, Russians, Armenians, I would add Portuguese, Japanese, they declined in West Fresno, and their descendants actually relocated across the, quote, good tracks, right? They moved to Clovis or a better part of Fresno. But now, with the Chinese dying out, right, you have a number of African Americans and Chicanos are increasing this area, right? So again, in this red light area, right, considered one of the worst areas historically, right, and which probably contributes to why Fresno is viewed a certain way in this country, in the state, right? So very interesting. So discussion questions I want you to write about. Does your city have a historical redlining that actually happens all over the nation? Clovis is a sundown town, which means if you're a minority by the sundown, you don't be there because you could be hurt, you could be mistreated, right? So that's all over the nation. There's sundown towns, right? That's scary, actually. Do you still see the effects today? Okay. How can we avoid and combat redlining? Because this has really affected Fresno historically in a negative way. And actually, we still have redlining now. It's illegal, but it still happens, right? In a kind of a not de jure, not by law way, but kind of de facto way. It still happens. There's still good parts of Fresno, good parts of Clovis where people want to go. So again, really fascinating things to think about. So learning outcomes, you learned about how the Chinese immigrated to Fresno and how they're mistreated and how they try to buy land, but then they're excluded from buying land and they're pushed into living in a Chinatown that had a lot of push areas, those negative things like drugs, prostitution, and gambling. And that mistreatment of Chinese led to segregation. And then when the Chinese were dying out, the other populations were moving in, but then their descendants moved out. And now it's primarily Chicano and African American. And this segregation actually currently still exists. So really fascinating. I want you to write more about this. So thank you so much. And I love to see you in class, and have a wonderful day. And so fascinating, our local and our kind of national history. All right. Have a great day.